Hey everyone, my name's Zach REDRUP. This is the It's Not a Phase podcast, and on this episode I'm joined by record producer Lewis Johns. Lewis has worked on records with the likes of Svalbard, Ithaca, Pupil Slicer, Modern Era, and tons more. We talk about how he got into music production, the difference between mixing, engineering and mastering, tips for people who want to get into music production themselves, and loads more. Before we get into it, if you enjoyed this episode or any other episode of the podcast, then please do me a big favour and support the podcast in any way that you can. It just takes a few seconds and it doesn't cost you a thing. You can hit subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to or watching this. Leave a review or comment. Give it a follow on social media. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can also join the Patreon, or you can pick up something from the merch store. You can find all the links to everything that you need in the description, or you can just head to itsnotaphase.co.uk. And now, here's my chat with Lewis. What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining me on this episode of It's Not a Phase, where I'm joined by Lewis Johns, who's a music producer based at the Ranch Production House in Southampton. How's it going, dude?
Yeah, good man. How you doing?
All good, all good. We're just saying, I've got the day off work today. You unfortunately don't, but hey, swings and roundabouts, man.
Right, I'm putting it off by doing this. So
Yeah, I'm distracting you for a little while. So yeah, before we kind of get into obviously your role as a producer, what a producer does, and all that kind of stuff. I just thought let's just kind of go back to the kind of the start of it all, I guess. So when you were growing up, what were your favorite bands and favorite albums?
ooh, I mean, from very early on, I was kind of surrounded by music, really, because my parents were both musicians and were in bands and stuff, and my dad was an engineer, so that's kind of how I got into it. But
Right.
from kind of very early on, I mean, my dad was always really into like proggy stuff, like bands like Yes and Frank Zappa, like that kind of stuff. He was also like well into the sort of guitar-based music, so that was my introduction, I guess, to like rock music back then. Um, so from very early on, Hendrix, stuff like that. And then I guess like it wasn't until I started hanging out with other people, like, down at the skate park or whatever, and people would be like, "Hey, have you listened to this band or whatever? You should check out this band." And that's when I got influenced. Well, yeah, that's when I got introduced to like bands like Limp Bizkit and the sort of late 90s, early 2000s kind of new metal scene.
Mm.
So that's kind of where I kind of began, and that's when I started a band and all the other stuff. So yeah, back then it would have been bands like Slipknot. I mean, Slipknot is still one of my favorite bands now.
Yeah.
Um, you know, System of a Down, that kind of stuff. Yeah, really love that stuff, and I still love it to this day. Actually, I was listening to a Korn record yesterday. So yeah, man.
Which Korn album were you listening to?
I actually listened to Untouchables yesterday.
That's
Yeah.
that's my favorite one. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's like a hot take for some reason, but I don't know.
So I remember like when it came out back in the day, I wasn't that into it.
Mm.
And it wasn't until later on in life I was like, oh, I actually do think this album's really good.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think
but
they
yeah,
didn't they spend like thousands upon thousands on production, like one of the most expensive metal albums of the time, I think.
yes, I read something similar recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all lived in like their own house, or they bought houses or something for it, and there's a whole thing on Wikipedia about it, isn't there? But it's
Yeah.
yeah, pretty interesting. But yeah, I think it stands up to this day. I think it sounds great.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few tracks on there that I think I think there's one like called Wake Up Hate or something. And to me that's like kind of it's not really aged very well, but I think as a whole album and like the production of it all, I just think it sounds amazing.
Yeah, production's really good.
Yeah.
I think the guy was Michael Benhorn or something,
I think so. Yeah.
something like that. But yeah, he did like stuff with like Soundgarden and stuff like that. So
Just a few small bands,
a couple of small ones, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Were there any particular albums when you were growing up that you listened to that inspired you in terms of like a production standpoint where you listened to it and like, oh, this sounds like, like something that you just really enjoyed in that sense?
Um, yeah, I mean, like to be honest, from really early on, I was always really interested in production.
Mm,
But I think because my dad was an engineer, my dad had a studio. He had a studio in his loft with like a tape machine and console and stuff like that. So I was always like really interested in how people made records. And obviously, back in the day when we had records, we would have the sleeves, and I would always like get out the sleeve and see who produced it. Um, but yeah, a couple of the ones that spring to mind were that first Mars Volta record, which I think was Rick Rubin produced it, but it was Rich Costey that mixed it. And he's to this day still probably my favorite mixer. I
Right.
remember listening to that for the first time and being like, fuck me, the drums sound so good on this record. Um, and I felt like it was a really immersive record. Like, you would get lost in it, which,
Yeah.
that's what I love about like really good productions is you almost don't notice the production anymore, but you're like, it makes you really just live in the record. A really good production can kind of do that, I think. So that record definitely was one of the first ones where I was like, fuck me, everything just sounds amazing. Um, and yeah, from then on, I was like, fuck, I'd love to record drums like this.
Yeah. Do you do you feel like when you listen to albums that you are kind of always thinking about the production? Like, are you thinking critically like that when you listen to records now?
Um, yes and no, because there's some stuff when I listen to it, I can kind of put it in a different place. Um, but yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the bad things I think about being a producer is you do sort of listen to stuff with a critical ear all the time.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel like if I notice the production on something, sometimes it really puts me off. Having said that, if it's super raw, I also love that too, because if it just sounds like the band playing in a room, the production bit, is not there for me. It doesn't bother
Yeah.
me. And that's why, like, records like Jane Doe, for instance, like that Converge record, like, I mean, it's so raw but that's what makes it amazing. Like, it just
Hmm.
sounds like the band are playing in front of you.
Yeah. 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 I
So
kind of
it depends on the record, I think, for me. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was like that when I just used to do like album reviews and live reviews. I've kind of like weaned myself out of it now, but I would go to a show and I'd be like trying to take everything in and take notes and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I guess like looking back now, did I fully enjoy and immerse myself in the experience? But yeah, I guess it's just when you kind of put yourself in a industry role like that, you,
hmm
you kind of it's just default. You just go into autopilot, I suppose.
hmm Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something you have to do. I think even in this job, like, when I'm mixing records or producing records, like, you get so stuck on the kind of fine minutiae of things sometimes that actually you have to pull yourself back out and be like, actually, how does it feel? Like, does it feel good? Maybe it doesn't matter that ride isn't, 5 dB louder than the other one or something, that kind of stuff doesn't matter. How am I going to feel when I listen to this, or how is the listener going to feel when they listen to this for the first time?
Hmm.
I, I think that's a very important thing to consider, I think, when you're doing records.
Yeah. But I mean, like, sometimes there's just things that are just hard to not notice. Like, let's take the infamous snare from Saint Anger. Like,
Mhm.
you can't ignore that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But having said that, I mean, it did make everyone talk about that record, right?
True.
Like, maybe maybe it was a good thing they did that. I
Yeah.
don't know. I think
True.
the out-tuned guitars annoy me more than the snare actually on that record.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you recall what the first release was that you produced? I imagine, obviously, when you were much younger, kind of for either music you were working on or I guess friends' bands or something like that.
hmm Um, So I started recording when I was about 13. So I started it really, really early on. And again, because my dad had this studio, I kind of like very early on learned to do it. So probably the first stuff that I recorded myself and that was released was my own band stuff. That's kind of how I that's kind of how I learned to record drums and I learned to record guitars and learned to sort of coach people into good performances because back then when I started recording, we didn't have Pro Tools and Logic and the computer and stuff, or it was in its very early phases. So,
Mm.
we were recording straight onto kind of hard disks and punching in and stuff. So I think, for me, that was actually probably a really, really good way to learn production. Like nowadays, it's so easy to just go like, well, we'll copy and paste that chorus because, you did it 5 times or whatever. But
Yeah.
so yeah, the earliest one, probably my own band stuff. And even actually later on, that band got signed to a little label in London that we ended up getting asked to go and record with this guy, Peter Lorentz at the time, he'd done like My Bloody Valentine and some quite big bands.
Mm.
But even then, because my production chops were sort of already up to skill, some of the stuff that he was doing, I wasn't maybe too super stoked on, and in the end, I ended up mixing that record anyway.
Right.
So that's kind of how it started. And then it was after that, I think that a couple of friends' bands from school were just like, "Hey, do you want to record my band?" You know, there wasn't really many studios around at the time. Um, and yeah, I would just get friends to come over my house. We'd set up all the drums in my lounge. And luckily, my parents were really cool with me doing this.
I
So
was gonna say, how do they feel about that? Yeah.
yeah, no, they were totally cool. Yeah, because I think that they saw that it was a passion of mine like really early on. So they were just like, well, if you want to do it, you fucking do it. Um, and I would say to bands like, well, give me 100 quid and I'll record and mix your EP or your album or something. I'm pretty sure I did a couple of albums for like 100 quid back in the day.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that's the kind of earliest side of it. Then after that, I went on to study it at university. I went to a place called the School of Audio Engineering in London. And that's where you sort of learn to use like the big format consoles, and you learn about the routing of stuff and all that kind of stuff. Um, and then yeah, and then after that, then I started. In fact, I was playing in bands like pretty much throughout that entire time. But I think for me, playing in bands back then was a really good thing because I would meet loads of other bands, and then
Yeah.
they would go, "Oh, we listened to your record. That's really cool. Would you be up for recording us?" And it was very naturally just sort of went on from that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah.
I guess. Yeah, because I know obviously one of the bands you were in was Good Time Boys. And I was just gonna, that leads on to my next question, which was gonna be, do you think that being in a recording band, if you want to be a producer, is important, kind of get that side of things and see what doesn't and does work with, like, I guess when you obviously work with bands yourself, you want to make that relationship whilst you're in the studio, not just make a good record and good songs. You
Mhm.
actually want to be able to kind of be on the same level and playing field with them so that you're both happy with what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps coming from like a band or musician perspective.
Hmm.
I only ever want to sort of see the band's vision through. I feel like there's a lot of producers out there that are maybe a little bit more like, well, you're coming to me for my sound, so you're going to do this and you're going to do it this way. Um, I'm very much the opposite of that. Like there's certain things that I will push and be like, oh, we should definitely do this because I know this is going to translate better. Um, but no, generally speaking, it's like, I feel like I want to make the band's record, the band's
Hmm.
best record that they can make. And, that's coming from my experience of recording with an engineer that didn't really give much of a shit about how my band sounded at the time. Um, so I think that is really important, yeah. And yeah, I'm always kind of like trying to get that band's vision across rather than just my own.
Yeah.
And definitely helps being a musician.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think sometimes bands get into a position with a producer where they're not really invested in the product. It's more like a paycheck to them. They just want to press the record button, put together the like the easiest thing they can, and then here's your music, and then on to the next one.
Hmm.
So yeah, obviously you want to build that relationship because that would then make the band come back to you. And obviously you've worked with several bands on multiple records.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think if you're doing it for a paycheck, you should not be in the music industry. It's not. It does not work out like
Yeah.
that. It's so much hard graft, and you have to really live it. Like, it's quite a difficult thing to get into, really, because there will be probably years and years and years where you don't really have much of a social life. You're doing stuff for super cheap. You're doing it after hours.
Mm.
Uh, but that's the only way you're going to improve and get better. And you have to really, really live it. If you're just doing it for a paycheck, I think that's like it's the wrong industry.
Yeah.
And those people will never last as well. Like, because that will come across in the records.
Yeah.
I, I certainly heard records where it sounds like the producer's just gone, here's my presets, go. You
Yeah.
know, um, yeah, I'd never want to do that. And I think that if people were in it just for that, then you should do something else.
Yeah. Stop. Yeah. Yeah. And just as a disclaimer, as you said before, like you're not charging £100 to do a whole album nowadays. Like people have to pay a bit more than that to do an album. That's not standard.
A little bit more than that now. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you recall at what point you got to this stage, obviously building this, I guess, catalog of stuff you've worked on and these bands that you've worked with and a reputation where you could turn, being a producer from a hobby or passion project into your career?
Um, I don't remember the exact time, but like I do remember when I was first trying to do it kind of after university and first trying to do it freelance. Obviously, you can't just do it and expect to have loads and loads of work. So
Mm.
when I first started doing it freelance, I was working at a venue at nights, and I was teaching guitar as well on the weekends. And both those things were kind of flexible, so I knew that if I had sessions in, then maybe I didn't have to do the venue stuff that week or something, or I could have a session in the day and go work at night or something.
Mm.
Um, and I basically just carried on going until I could be like, right, I can maybe drop off the venue stuff now and just teach guitar on the weekends and do production. And then eventually it got to the point where I was like, oh no, I feel like I'm okay to now stop that and just do the production full time. Um, I don't remember exactly when that was, to be honest.
Yeah.
It was all quite natural, but I do remember there was probably a couple of records, or at least one record in particular that I did that got suddenly people interested in what I was doing. I worked with a band called Bastions. If you remember them, they're part of the sort of UK swell scene, as we used to call it, like back in the day. And yeah, I did Bastion's first album. Again, I actually did it super cheap. Like when I look back on that now, I'm like,
Yeah.
such a good deal. But like it was so good for my career because, Frank Carter guested on it, and I think there were like among the sort of UK scene of hardcore, like Bastions
Mm.
were quite highly looked up to. So, um, and at the time that record turned out good. Like, I was super happy with how it sounded at the time. Obviously, if I did it now, it'd be totally different. But
Yeah.
and yeah, that was the kind of moment where I was like, oh, people are starting to notice now, which is nice. I was getting more inquiries from that, and I think it was probably around that time that I was just like, oh, I'll just make this a full-time thing now.
Right. Were you like before that happened, how were you going about building up the kind of, I guess, client base? Were you actually reaching out to bands to say, hey, if you're doing anything soon, I'd love to work on whatever you're working on next, and or is it always kind of them coming to you based off what they've heard you doing already?
Yeah, I think like back in the day, there's definitely a bit of that. It helped that I was playing in a band at that time. So I played in a band called The Long Haul, which was kind of convergy hardcore band.
Hmm.
And we toured a lot, and we toured with a lot of bands like back then, the like Good Time Boys before I was in them, and a band called Veils and Bastions, and that era of Holy Roar and Tangle Talk bands. So I was in that scene of people already, and I think because I'd done a couple of long haul records that had a that sort of hardcore sound that maybe people weren't really doing much of in the UK. I think that attracted that kind of band.
Hmm.
And because I was in that scene touring, it was very easy to chat to these people. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely elements of like contacting bands, and if I really liked what they did and I thought I could bring something to the table, I'll contact them. I would never do blanket emails to people. Like, I mean, I've seen that people do that nowadays, and I think that bands can see right through that kind of shit. Um, you know, and I say to the assistants and the interns and stuff here, like, you should be hustling, but like, make sure you can bring something to the table when you reach out to a band, because if you just blanket email someone and say, you should come record with me, they're going to be like, well, why?
Hmm.
What can you bring to this? So, yeah, there was definitely a bit of that back in the day, but it was all quite natural, to be honest.
Yeah. I think that's something that, people need to take into account in any kind of freelance role. Like, don't do blanket emails. You want to make these obviously it's going to take more time, but you need to make a kind of personal connection, like use their name, refer to stuff they've done that you've enjoyed, or be more specific in what you're saying in your emails to say, like you just said, what can you bring to the table? Why should they work with you?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned, some of the bands you worked with like towards the beginning, like you said, Veils, Upriver, The Catharsis, like some of their records, and nowadays you're working on like the latest records from like Svalbard and Pupil Slicer. What's your process nowadays when you are working with a new band that you never worked with before? What's kind of that exchange before you agree, like, yes, I'd like to go ahead and work on this next release that you want to put out?
Um, I mean, it's always quite a process, to be honest, working with a new band, because you don't really know if you're even going to vibe a lot of the time, you know.
Mm,
And I think the main thing for me is I try and get in a room with them like straight away, or jump on a call, like jump on a Zoom or something, just see what they're about, see if I can bring anything to it, see if I'm the right fit for it. I think sometimes I tend to say like, look, come in, recorded it, maybe one song, and we'll just see how it goes. And that was definitely the case with Pupil Slicer actually. Got them in for one song, saw how we would get on, saw how the process would be, and then after that, then we could start planning. Okay, well, we're going to do this album. We're going to do it like this, you know.
yeah,
Uh, There's definitely a lot of that stuff, but I mean, for every record, to be honest, even with the bands that you've worked with for 10 years, like there's still that process beforehand of like, what is this about? What are we trying to achieve? And pre-production is a big thing with that stuff, demos back and forth, notes back and forth. So there's a lot of planning when it comes to do records. But yeah, I would say more so with a new band for sure.
yeah. Is it mainly bands that are coming to you, or is it labels or managers? Like what's kind of that ratio there? Is it usually contacts for said bands?
Yeah, it's usually it's a bit of both, really. Sometimes a label will approach me because the band have asked for me specifically. That happened with Earth 10-9, and a couple of other things recently, but sometimes it's just the bands, and bands like Relative Massey, for instance, like I've got such a good relationship with those guys that we chat all the time, and they would come to me and ask me about doing anything new rather than management, label, all the other
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
So it really just depends. I like to just be in contact with the band usually.
yeah,
um I think that I have a manager that deals with the label side and the management side, and I like to try and keep that separate as much as I can. um just because the industry can be frustrating. There can be a lot of back and forth with negotiations and stuff. That's the stuff that I don't want to get involved with.
mm,
I'd rather stick to the creative side, and I'd rather the band not even think about that shit either. I just want to talk about the music and
mm,
production with the band rather than how much am I getting paid.
yeah, yeah. What's kind of like I guess it'll depend on how busy you are and what your schedule looks like, but what's the general, like, I guess, lead up time before you get into the studio and start, putting these tracks down and stuff. And I guess as well, it would depend on what the project is, right? Like a full length album is going to take longer than an EP or just a single or two.
Hmm. Um, I mean, usually we're planning stuff like 6 to 8 months in advance for an album, before they even enter the studio.
Mm,
Um, and then it really depends on the band and the budget and stuff and how long we're going to spend on it. But there's been times where I think Pupil Slicer we spent months maybe doing that record. Same with the last Rolo one. And it's you have that sort of creative moment in the month, but everything's been planned out beforehand, so you have a pretty good idea on what you're doing in that time. And then if I'm mixing it, which most of the time I am these days, I usually leave it kind of a month until I start mixing it just to do it on fresh ears. And then there's the whole process of then waiting probably sometimes a year before it comes out.
right.
There's certainly stuff that I did recorded a year ago that hasn't even been released yet.
Okay.
So that can be frustrating sometimes because you're sitting there thinking, oh, it's a month before it's going to be released, and wish I could remix it now because I'd do a much better job of it. But like, is what it is.
Yeah. Do you get that quite often where you listen back to stuff and like, oh, I wish if I had maybe a bit more time on it, or if I had my hands on it today, I could do a much better job, or I'd tweak this bit here and stuff like
Oh yeah, like every record. Yeah.
that.
I mean that's the way of like the creative industry. I think like
Mm,
you're looking to improve, um, and I think that yeah, there's some stuff that I was doing a year ago that I probably wouldn't be doing now.
mm,
Um, but having said that, it captures a moment in time, and I actually sometimes really like listening back to older records I did with completely different techniques because I'm like, oh fuck it, that's actually pretty cool. I might bring that back.
yeah.
Uh, so yeah, it all depends really. But yeah, usually 2 weeks after it's done, I'm like, fuck, I want to be on it. But yeah, you have to get to a point, I think, with this stuff where you're like, no, that's good. That's a moment in time. Move on.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like it's a strange question, isn't it? Because it's like when is an album done? When is a song done? Because you could technically work on it indefinitely, couldn't you?
Yeah. And actually bands are like they find that much harder to know when an album is done. Usually it has to be me that has the final say of no, this is great. Like, stop worrying about whether that synth could be a dB louder because in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter.
Mm,
There's definitely that. And I find that there's usually that with bands that are the newer bands,
yeah.
like the first album bands. And rightly so, because it's their first album, it's the first thing that's going out in the world, and they want it to be perfect. They want it to be the best, possible kind of thing that they could release, I do get it. Bands as they kind of get older in their career, they're less like that. They're just like what will be kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Certainly like it with a lot of the band, like Rollers are very, very good example of that. They know exactly what they want, but they're happy for it to just be like that thing. And I think that's what's great about that band. They'll always evolve.
Yeah. And just know when this next iteration of whatever they've become is kind of at its peak, at least at that point when they're in the studio with you.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever had any like pinch me moments, like imposter syndrome moments of working with specific bands or records in your career?
Yeah, yeah, definitely have. So when I worked with Funeral for a Friend, that was quite a big thing because I really loved that band growing up.
Yeah.
And actually for a number of reasons, I really loved the production on that first record as well. I thought it was amazing. Like Colin Richardson obviously did some amazing records back then. Um, and that was certainly like a big one for me. I remember like when Matt originally phoned me, at the time he played in another hardcore band, and I was mostly recording hardcore because I did this record fucking ages ago.
Hmm.
So I was mostly recording just hardcore bands, and he phoned me and he was like, "Oh, Lou, would you be up for doing a record?" And in my head, I was like, with his hardcore band, that's just what I thought. I was like, "Yeah, yeah, absolutely, mate. I'd love to do that."
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, is this for so and so?" And he was like, "No, no, no, it's for funeral." And I was like, "Why? Why?
Why?
Why contacting me about this?" Um, so that was probably at that time one of the sort of big moments, and especially when I met him and I realized he loved loads of bands that I'd done, and he loved my band at the time as well. That was the other thing, so that was quite cool. But yeah, you get those little milestones, I think, as you go along. The most recent one was definitely Earth Tone 9. I listened to Earth Tone 9 when I was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And yeah, never would have dreamed I'd be recording them, producing their new record. But like, yeah, it was great. I mean, I deal with those situations much better now because I'm a bit older, and I kind of realized, well, they're coming to me because they like what I'm doing. So, you
Yeah.
just sit into the job a little bit more. But look,
Yeah.
definitely back in the day when that stuff happened, I would be a bit more like, what do you want me to do? So,
Yeah.
but no, like, yeah.
Yeah. We mentioned before, you're based at the Ranch Production House, which is in Southampton, and there's a few other
Mm.
mixers and engineers there that you share that space with. Do you often collaborate with one another on certain projects? Like if you've got like each got different strengths and weaknesses, or if you just have, I guess, deadlines to meet?
Yeah. I mean, so we've got three studios here.
Right.
We've got this one, which is my mix room. We've got the main studio, which is this kind of the one with the big live room and where all the drums and stuff gets done. Then we've got another studio next door, which is like the Atmos room, which is also sort of doubles up as Studio B. Um, and yeah, so the main kind of core, I would say, would be me, Neil Kennedy, and Daly. And we all do pretty different things, to be honest. Um, and yeah, we sometimes collaborate with stuff on stuff. So me and Neil have worked over the last couple of years with a band called Knife Bride. Um, and he does all the sort of production elements of it, and I usually mix it after the fact. And that's worked really well because, Neil is very, very creative. Um, he loves getting stuck in production. He's a really, really good songwriter. Um, but they're a bit more of like I would say they're kind of metal at the core, but it's
Hmm.
like poppy metal. I don't know if you've listened to them. So they need something that in mix wise it's a little bit more precise, I guess, and that's where our skills kind of join up and I think work really, really well with that band.
Yeah.
So it does happen sometimes. I mean, there's the kind of extended group of people that work here as well. So we've got Kel Pinchin, who is my assistant, but I mean he's doing amazing work in his own right now. He plays in a band called Modern Era, and he's just recently done the Split Chain stuff, which sounds great. Lizzie Farrell. So yeah, he's doing amazing work, and me and him collaborate on stuff all the time. So he does sometimes my edits for me, and he does a lot of my mix prep and that kind of stuff. So there's a whole kind of machine of people that kind of work together here. A couple of the other guys, there's a couple of Matts that work here as well that are great editors. They're always jumping in and out like as and when they can.
Hmm.
And Lou as well, another engineer who's great. So yeah, it's nice. There's a lot of crossover. We're like a little family here, which is quite nice.
That's good. Yeah. 'Cause I guess some people are a bit like precious of the stuff that they work on, and that's like they want to just work on that thing and only have their name on it. But yeah, I think sometimes you have to realize like other people can help make not only things easier, but sometimes better than maybe you could do on your own because you don't always have sometimes you have like blinkers on what your vision is on a project, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean that was definitely me. Like I would say, back in the day, or not even back in the day, really, like even 5 years ago,
Mm.
I was so I had to do everything. Like, I didn't really trust anyone else to do anything, even stuff like drum edits. I'd be like, nope, I need to do this, even though it's a fucking boring job, and it takes ages. It's something that I just needed the control over.
Yeah.
I need control over every aspect of this record because it's going out under my name, and if it isn't perfect, then it's not right. Um, but actually, putting more trust in other people, like I mean, Kel has been an absolute lifesaver for me, to be honest. Because it does get to the point where you're like, I need to have a social life, and I need to not be here for, you know, 12 hours a day every day doing stuff. I need the help. And I did invest a bit of time into Kel. But like mate, he saves my ass so much now. And
Mm.
like, we do so many sessions now where I go, right, you can track it or you can track the drums and I'll just do the production stuff and then he gives it to me to mix and it's perfect.
Yeah.
Uh, and I never used to be able to let go quite as much as I can now.
Mm.
Don't get me wrong, I've still got massively high standards, as a lot of
Yeah.
the other people will tell you here. But like, for me, I think it's made the job easier and it's made my work better. Because I can just focus on the fun, creative stuff. I can just focus on it being the best thing it can be, rather than being like, oh, I need to, I don't know, tune the bass or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
And you can have a bit more of a social life as well. So that's another win. Yeah.
exactly. I try and take a couple of days off a week now, which is great. That never
Yeah.
happened back in the day.
Was there any, because obviously you mentioned that you mainly work with like hardcore bands and heavier bands. Is there any style of music that you would like to work on but haven't had a chance to yet?
Um, yeah, to be honest, like I mean, like I know I'm kind of I do a lot of heavy stuff. But I like so many different types of music, you know. I like stuff like Childish Gambino and, you know, one of my favorite bands in the world is Mew. If you listen to
Yeah,
them,
yeah, me, yeah.
um, and I love the production on the Mew records as well. Like they're records that are really immersive to me. And they're the sounds that come out of those records are like I'm sitting there thinking like, how are they doing this? Like, you know, it's not just someone's plugged into Neural DSP and recorded it on, I don't know, whatever. Um, yeah, those kind of records really excite me, and I would like to do more of that stuff. You know, I would like to do more of the poppier stuff as well. I think you know, I'm really into the production elements of pop or good pop music. I mean,
Yeah.
not the crap stuff. Um, so like, yeah, I would definitely do that. And to be honest, like, you know, I've always aspired to be someone like a Rich Costey, who, you know, is the kind of producer that can work with Mars Volta, or, you know, he can I mean, he's done so many records. He worked on the Haim record, like one of the Haim records. He did like Fiona Apple, which when the Paul on that record sounds absolutely incredible. And he worked on Deftones, you know, that's like four or five completely different bands,
Mm,
and it's amazing that he can put his skill to all of those, and he never it never sounds like a Rich Costey has just done his thing on it either. It always just sounds like the band is the best version of that thing they're doing.
yeah.
Yeah, would love to do more of that stuff. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. I mean, I'm sort of pushing for a bit more of that nowadays anyway.
Yeah.
I'm actually, to be honest, nowadays I would say that the majority of stuff I'm doing is mixing. I still produce like a handful of records a year. You know, and if I'm producing a record, then I want to spend a good amount of time on it. Um, but yeah, so much stuff I'm getting now is produced by well other producers, you know,
Mm,
other engineers, and I'm just mixing it, which
right.
is cool too. You know, I enjoy doing that stuff. So yeah, like we'll see. You never know what my career trajectory is going to be in a year or two's time.
Yeah.
Could just stop mixing completely and, you know, just do production again. So
Yeah. Definitely. Like, who knows? You could be in the next few years recording and mixing the next big pop star. Who knows?
we'll see. I doubt it, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Um, well, I feel like, some people listening have maybe very like limited, like knowledge on what the whole process is. So I guess like a fundamental question I probably should have brought up earlier, but for people listening who aren't quite sure, can you like briefly explain the difference between producing, mixing, and also mastering? I think people get confused as to what each of those parts are and what role they play in making a record.
Yeah. So I would probably add another one into there as well, engineering. So producing and engineering nowadays, it does overlap a little bit, but the role of a producer is really to get the band's song the best it can possibly be. And sometimes that's stuff like, you know, choosing what sounds to have on the record, and sometimes it's stuff like this chorus is too long, we need to shorten it, or, you know, we need to change the arrangement of this song a little bit, or have you thought about adding this part in, or have you thought about adding these vocal parts in? So that's very much the like production aspect of making a record. um Back in the day they would have like a producer and an engineer. So obviously the most well-known producer that people probably know is Rick Rubin. He isn't an engineer at all. He doesn't engineer anything. He just sits at the back of the room and goes like, this needs to be a different tempo, and, you know, that could be sung better. um, and then the engineer's job would be to make sure that, you know, stuff like the miking of the instruments is really really good, and the capture, basically the capture of what you're getting is really really nice, the cleanest it can be, kind of thing. um, so nowadays, I mean, especially with how production is now, budgets aren't as big as what they used to be. So the producer and engineer hat is kind of similar, basically. And, you know, a lot of the time on records, I'm producing and engineering it. So, you know, I'm doing the drum tuning for everything, and I'm doing the drum selection, and I'm going like, okay, well, we should use this mic on your vocal because it's got a nicer mid-range than the other one, and stuff like that. It kind of does blur together sometimes, that stuff, but because you're still just trying to get the best kind of best thing out of that band. So that would be the sort of producer engineer aspect. The mixing aspect would be, so once everything's recorded and done, it's then would be my job to make it sound really good, make it
Mm.
sound really exciting, make it translate onto smaller speakers or big speakers or whatever. Um, and that's a long process. And I think that people don't appreciate how long that can take sometimes. Like I've just finished mixing an album. I'm sure I'm allowed to say, but it's for Employed to Serve, like a new Employed to Serve album. And that was like a 3 week mix. It was 3 weeks every day mixing it. And I'm really happy with how it sounds, but like, it's a lot of work.
Mm.
Um, so that's the mixing part, just making sure everything sounds the best it can be. All the individual elements like drums, bass, guitar, vocals. And then finally the mastering is like the icing on the cake. So it's like once you've done your mix, the mastering engineer will make sure it translates to small speakers. They usually make sure it's loud enough that it will be competitive next to other songs.
Right.
Um, they'll make sure it is good for going onto vinyl. There's like a couple of processes you have to do to make sure that it, plays properly on vinyl. Sometimes there's mastered for iTunes and stuff like that, the different kind of like aspects of that stuff. It's still creative, the mastering thing, but it's certainly more of a technical thing,
Yeah.
making sure the metadata is in like all the files and stuff like that, right? So that when it gets submit to Spotify, you can see who wrote the song and whatever else. So that would be the mastering engineer's job.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's I mean I won't mention like the record, but there's one specific album that I listened to. And there's only one song, like it's the second song in, and the volume is just so much higher on that song. So as soon as it kicks in, I have to like turn it right down because it
Yeah.
starts hitting my ears right away. So I guess like that's obviously an important part of that whole process as well, just making sure that the overall volume throughout is consistent.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, like you'd have thought as a mixer you would try to do that on an album, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like having spoken to the mastering engineer I use quite a lot, Grant Berry, amazing mastering engineer. He yeah, he gets some real interesting ones in where yes, sometimes song two is like twice as loud and completely different. And, I'm always like referencing the stuff I've already mixed to make sure everything's consistent and
Yeah.
so yeah, that it's that as well,
Yeah.
make sure it all flows correctly for an album.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's people listening now who are, interested in the world of, production, mixing and all that stuff, what would you suggest is like a good starting point for an absolute beginner? Where should they begin in that journey?
I mean, for an absolute beginner, there's so much free information out there now. Obviously, YouTube exists, so
Yeah.
uh, plenty of stuff on there. But I will say that for anyone starting out, take it with a pinch of salt because there's a lot of people that are just doing YouTube that actually aren't making records in the real world that will say sometimes you need to be doing this, you need to be hitting minus whatever bluffs or. And just take that stuff with a pinch of salt because like that's not how it's done in the real world.
Mm,
Uh, but I would say if it's something that you feel really passionate about and you want to do it, try and make friends with producers and engineers. Try and shadow, try and be in the studio as much as you can, and find someone that you look up to that maybe will be okay with you sitting in on a couple of sessions and really really take note because that's where you're gonna learn. Um, I'm always trying to say to because we've got a couple of interns and stuff here. I'm always saying like you have to just be here as much as you can because there's so much information to take in, and learn the stuff that the other engineers don't want to do. Like
mm,
learn how to like edit drums, learn how to edit vocals, be really useful. Because if you can show that you're super useful at doing that stuff, you'll very quickly have a lot of work, because it's the kind of stuff that people like me don't want to do.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's certainly how Kel was doing it. And a couple of the other guys now getting really, really good at drum editing and stuff. And, you know, suddenly there's like 5 engineers here that they can edit drums for. So
Yeah. Saves you a job.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's an awful job as well. So
Yeah. What do you think's the hardest, or I guess maybe the biggest, most common pitfall that producers would fall into as they're kind of getting their bearings on what a producer is?
hmm. Um, I don't know really. I mean, I guess like when you first start is like having the work, right? Like,
Yeah.
for anyone first starting is like, if you don't really have much coming in, um, that can be tricky. But I think that you've kind of got to just do whatever you can to make it work. Get a second job, you know,
Yeah.
work in the evenings or something just to make it work. Um, but I think that's probably the thing that I would see the most. Yeah, people that are just like, I want to be here and learn, but I'm not getting the work in myself. Well,
Mm.
you have to just like throw yourself in and do it.
Yeah.
That's the only way you're going to get it, really.
Yeah. And what about bands that are coming to you and they want to work with you? What position should they be in before they even try to reach out to you? And assuming that you do want to work with them, what can they expect from their first experience with a producer?
Um, so any band can reach out to me. If it's something that I really like, I'll do it.
Right.
You don't have to be on a label or anything like that. Budget's another thing, but like, um, expect to be if it's your first time in the studio, maybe just expect to be worked pretty hard. You know, I think that's the thing I hear probably the most. People don't realize like how much work and how much time and effort goes into making a great record. Um, and I think that people have been quite surprised sometimes on how hard I work people. It's never in a negative way.
Yeah.
So I'm working with the band to get something great, but like, it does take the effort to get something really, really good. So I would say for any band like that, just make sure you're really, really prepared for everything. Make sure you've learned everything and backwards, because stuff does change and you need to be ready to be like, okay, well, this is how I did it, but I'm cool with maybe trying something else because I know that part inside out.
Yeah.
And also just be open-minded because remember, if you're coming to a producer, like any producer that's been doing it for a long time, they're recording bands and they're producing bands every day. If they suggest something, it might not always be the right thing, but there's usually a reason why they're suggesting it. I've certainly seen this from newer bands coming up where they don't necessarily take advice about maybe how the song structure should be or something like that. And I'm thinking, but I listen to songs every day, and this is literally what I do. So it
Yeah.
it it can be frustrating sometimes, but like, at the end of the day, you're still working to get the same thing. I always say to bands like, I'm gonna bring up everything. Like if there's something that you disagree with and we're having a fallout over, don't take it personally. This is the way we're gonna make a really great record. I'd
Yeah.
rather say something than just not say anything and then for it to suck.
Yeah.
Um, and also, I like to be proven wrong sometimes as well. So if there's something I suggest and you really push back on it and you give me a good reason and it turns out better, great. We've had that conversation. At least we know that part is the best it could be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they can't be like, I think you've got to as well think like they can't be malicious intent because this is your name going on the record as well. You want the best product and they want the best product. So it's just a matter of trying to kind of meet in the middle maybe sometimes, or just realize what the other person wants out of this album and just kind of trying to see that vision.
Hmm. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So what's your favorite part about what you do?
It's, I mean, I get to meet so many awesome people. That sounds really cliched, but it's true. Like that, loads of my really good mates are people that I've recorded for like 10 years. Um, I know, like the creative side for me is the most kind of rewarding aspect, I think. I mean, especially nowadays, as I'm not really playing music in a band, so I kind of get my creative output into helping other bands do stuff. Um, and yeah, that's seeing something like that, like kind of come to life and seeing the band's vision through, and suddenly they've put their first single out and everyone's stoked on it, and people are talking about it. That's really really exciting for me.
Yeah.
But I fucking love doing it. Like I've been doing it for a long time now, and I still have the same feeling of making records that I did when I was like 13 starting off. So it's something I'll always continue to do
Mm.
until I can't hear anymore, and then I might stop. But
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of important to hear if you're doing what you do. Yeah. Yeah. What would you say is your least favorite part about what you do? Like, I guess it might even be stuff that's the less creative stuff, like having to like all the business side and deadlines and invoices and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah, it's definitely the industry side of it, for sure. Like, I mean, some people in the industry are amazing. Some people are really fickle, and still seems like this common thing of like nowadays, oh, we need to get a big name on this, or we need to do this, and that stuff's just rubbish. I think just use your ears and see what sounds the best. So that side of it does really frustrate me. Um, but again, I try not to deal with it too much. I try just to do the creative side, um, and just to make the band happy. I don't couldn't really give much of a fuck about making a label happy. Um, Hopefully, not many labels are going to watch this.
Yeah.
But like in the nicest possible way, it's the label. There's some amazing labels that I've worked with, but you have to remember the label have usually signed the band for a reason,
Yeah.
and that's usually the sound of their band. And so many times like you see a band get signed by a major label and suddenly everything changes because suddenly the label are going, well, you need to co-write with so and so and you need to be put in a room with so and so, and suddenly it's not that band anymore that they signed. And then suddenly their records don't do very well and they're dropped, and I'm thinking, well, whose fault is that? Like, you didn't
Yeah.
the band do their thing. So that part of it is frustrating, but I think it's just been the way for a long time. It
Yeah.
hasn't really changed.
That's such a strange mindset, isn't it? Because obviously they've signed the band because they liked how they sounded and who they are as
Mhm.
a band, and they obviously saw potential. So then why, if you've got what you wanted, would you then change it? I don't get it.
Yeah, well, I think that there's not always, but sometimes you get egos within like certain A&Rs or whatever, because if they've signed a band that's done really well, then suddenly they'll be like, well, you should listen to me because you know, which isn't always the case. Like every band is completely different, and you should work on that band on their own merit rather than what you've done previously.
Yeah.
Mm. But yeah, it does happen, and not with every label. Like some labels are absolutely brilliant. In fact, most of them are, to be honest. It's just every now and then, it's usually when the band start doing quite well, then the labels want to get involved. That's usually the thing. But
Hmm.
it's good. Just a
Yeah.
part of it, really. Just something that you learn to sort of deal with.
Yeah. That's kind of the price you've got to pay to do what you love to do, unfortunately. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned before, you've obviously worked on the recent Employed to Serve album. What else is kind of planned for 2024 so far? Can you talk about who else you are scheduled to work with, or if there's albums that are in the pipeline to come out this year that you've worked on that people should look out for? What's on the agenda for
Yeah.
this year?
Well, there's a couple of things I probably aren't allowed to say.
That's fair.
Um, but like the sort of recent ones I'm really looking forward to are Earth Tone 9. Obviously, that one's coming out, I think, next month. I think it's June. Um, there's obviously Employed Serve that is coming out in. Actually, that's not going to be this year. Actually, it'll be probably next year. Yeah, a couple of other bits and bobs. I've got like we worked with a really cool band called Lowen, who actually my assistant tracked most of it. Kel tracked most of it. And I sort of did additional production and mixed it. But that record turned out great. It sounds really cool. So that's coming out, I think, on Church Road. And yeah, a couple of bits and bobs. There's stuff. There's some really cool stuff in the diary, like later on in the year, which I'm really looking forward to. A couple of productions I can kind of like stick my teeth into, which is good. Um, yeah, I started working with like a drum company called That Sound um fairly recently, and I think that there's more planned for that. So a couple more drum sample packs in the pipeline. Which is really cool. I love that company, so it's cool that I'm getting to do stuff with them. Yeah, more of that stuff really. Lots of mixing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and hopefully some big pop acts that you want to bring in.
I feel like I've oversold the pop thing. Yeah, not looking for like pop,
Yeah, yeah, I get you.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks very much for taking the time with us. Really appreciate your insight and your knowledge and stories and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure people listening to it will definitely get something out of this conversation. Before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your day working on tracking, any final words, anything you want to say or plug? Floor's yours.
oh, I can plug my drum library.
Yeah,
So yeah, that sound it's called Modern Rock Drums. Um, Super happy with that. That's how that turned out. Loads of really cool one shots in there, loads of loops. It's really creative. Yeah, that's available on Splice. So yeah, if you just type in that sound Modern Rock Drums, it should come up.
cool. And where should people go if they want to work with you, I guess?
You can just go to my website. It's just lewisjohns.co.uk. There's a contact form on there. Yeah, just go to there and do it. Um, or you can get in touch via Instagram. There's a couple of like links in my Instagram bio to my manager and stuff. You can go on there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day and yeah, take care of yourself.
Yeah, you too, man.
Yep. See you later, dude. And that's it. Thanks so much for tuning in to It's Not a Phase. If you enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Leave a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Follow the podcast on social media. And maybe even join the Patreon or grab some merch from the store. You can find everything that you need at itsnotaphase.co.uk. That's itsnotaphase.co.uk. Thanks again. Hopefully catch you on the next one. And remember, it's not a phase, it's a lifestyle.